Hi, good afternoon. We're going to get started here. So this is the Internet of Things track this afternoon. My name is Robert Brown. I spoke here last year at the Internet of Things track, and it's a great privilege to be invited back to talk to you again. I spoke about trusted execution environments last year, and this year I'm going to highlight some of the identity and access management problems that we've been seeing in the Internet of Things, take a look at the landscape of the Internet of Things providers and the technology stack, and then Paul's going to talk about some of the solutions that will go to solving those issues. So I'm an independent consultant. My background is in chip security. I used to work at a company called ARM that designs microprocessors, and I've been working on marketing trusted execution environments, and I'm looking at chip to cloud security. The reason for the name Atacama, well, chips are made of sand. There's lots of sand in a desert. The Atacama Desert's very cloudy. So that's why my company's called that. So just to start off on things, anyone seen The Italian Job? And I'm not talking about the pointless remake in 2003, the original one, 1969. Yeah? Great. So this was the first film of Internet of Things hacking. What do you mean the internet wasn't invented then? Okay, so 1969, these guys come up with a plan to steal mafia gold by hacking the traffic light system of Turin and the CCTV system. So while you guys were putting man on the moon in America, we were hacking the Internet of Things in the UK. So later on, 45 years later, some Israeli guys have a bit of a better idea. Rather than hacking the Internet of Things, they decide to hack the sat-nav system, Waze. So some researchers at Ben-Gurion University in Tel Aviv wanted to have a clear road to drive down, and drive down it quickly with no other traffic on it. So they were very ingenious. They enrolled a ghost army of Android emulation environments, enrolled a ghost army of users, and then started feeding fake GPS coordinates into the system. That put a traffic jam in Waze's eyes on that road. Of course, it rerouted all the legitimate users around the traffic jam that didn't exist. So they got to drive on a nice, clear road very quickly. Ingenious. So what would be the 2017 remake of The Italian Job? Well, yeah, it would have to involve some off-grid vintage minis. But then again, would it? Would Charlie Croker come up with a plan to put a ransomware hack in the traffic light system and make off with the bitcoins? No minis needed at all. So let's take a look at some of the other problems in the Internet of Things. Not meaning to pick on any manufacturers in particular, but looking at the kinds of things that will have to happen in devices that are being put into systems that are going to last 15, 20 years. You're going to need to put updates onto them. So what about unauthorized firmware updates? Well, the Nest thermostat, I don't know if you heard about this. This was in January 2016. Nest rolled out an update. It had a bug in it. The bug was that if your thermostat wasn't plugged into the mains power outlet, the battery ran flat in 2 weeks. Okay, so your house gets a bit cold and then you go and recharge the thermostat. No big deal. Well, what if you're not there? What if it's your vacation property in the mountains? And this did happen to somebody's vacation property. It got flooded because pipes burst. It froze. How do you involve the user in the update process? Should they be authorizing the update? Then Tesla and the Keen security lab in China. This is actually really scary. If you watch the videos of what they were able to do to this car, they were able to open the trunk while it was moving down the freeway. They were able to apply the brakes at will from 8 miles away in their lab. The reason they got in was that the gateway of the car was assumed to be secure, and therefore all of the components within the vehicle network trusted the gateway. And they didn't do any checking of firmware signatures. They just applied them. Thankfully, that's changed. So there are other examples of firmware that's been updated in light bulbs. So the Hue light bulbs, and I think this is to do with the Zigbee light link protocol. Somebody somewhere thought it would be a great idea that firmware updates could propagate across multiple light bulbs and spread peer-to-peer. And this involved having a shared key for every firmware update on that protocol. So all the manufacturers of light bulbs with the Zigbee protocol had the same key, and they had to keep it safe, except one of them didn't keep it quite as safe as they should. So this enabled the attackers to deliver a payload to Zigbee-connected light bulbs via drone. And as soon as one light bulb got infected, the whole system in a building got infected. And the worst case was you could never recover, because if you tried to recover one light bulb, it would automatically get updated with the infected firmware again. So you're having to replace all the light bulbs in a building. Big problems with updates and authorizations in IoT. I think we've heard about this one, the guy who was surprised by his next-door neighbor who popped round for a bag of sugar, and he was just getting to his front door, and the neighbor said, "Oh, it's okay, I can open the front door for you." He said, "Well, how can you open my front door?" He said, "It's easy." He opened the letterbox, shouted through it, "Hey Siri, open the front door," and open sesame, he was in. So, here's a big problem of conflating speech recognition with voice recognition. There's a huge difference. That needs to be fixed, and voice recognition needs to be done on the device in the same way that fingerprint recognition is done on a device. We heard about the guy who had a Tesla, drove it out to the desert, and because he was out of cell phone range, when he got back from watching the sunset, couldn't get back in the car. He had a 6-mile jog to a gas station to phone up his wife to bring him the key to the car. And this is ridiculous. You've got 2 supercomputers in the desert, right? And they can't talk to each other to let the driver in. And speaking of supercomputers and AI, AI could be trained by bad sources. That graph there is what happened when AP News got hacked and they put out a tweet saying that the White House had been blown up. And that wipes off about 90 billion off the stock exchange, briefly. But if you're talking about the Internet of Things where you can train AIs to do bad things, and we've already seen examples of this where artificial intelligences have learned to lie and cheat. Where are they getting their training from? Who is telling them what to do? And unfortunately for Microsoft's Tay, it only took 1 day before it turned into a racist and had to be shut down. So all of these problems point to a lack of identity and access management of things. So traditionally, what we've been focusing on as InfoSec professionals is the integrity, the confidentiality, and the availability of data. That's fine for information technology, but when you're dealing with the physical world, which is what the Internet of Things does, there's a whole realm of attributes that you need to start caring about. You need to start caring about, can I still use this thing in a convenient way? Is the data authentic? Do I still have control over the system? Is it going to affect people's safety? Is it going to kill people? This is why the Internet of Things needs identity and access management professionals to step in and help. If we take a look at what a thing is, basically it's something that takes inputs, processes it, and performs some action in the physical world. And that's traditionally what devices like thermostats that are unconnected have done. They've taken an input and they've created an output. The Internet of Things aims to aggregate all of that data from all of the thermostats and help make better decisions for thermostats and put that back down to the thing level. But sometimes going all the way to the internet and back again is a bit too far, especially when things need to be, and decisions need to be made in real time. So that's where edge gateways come in. Now, looking at the stack for the Internet of Things, it's quite scary. If you want to take a photo of this and study it later, this is from chip to cloud. So all the way down, processor architecture and isolation capabilities, the security blocks in a chip, going up to silicon chip manufacturers, embedded firmware, communications, how you sign and protect code, how you put an identity into a thing, and then all the way up to the platform, up to cloud gateways, authentication, authorizations, directories. There's no one player that can cover the whole stack. It's going to need a lot of partnerships and ecosystem building. Now, you've got the traditional IAM providers there on the left, but there's a lot of movement coming along from IoT platform vendors. On the right-hand side, you've got the mobile operators that have SIM card technology and trusted platform modules that will be moving up from the hardware into the identity and access management stacks as well. So there's a lot of movement, a lot of players in the identity and access management of things. I'll leave you with a couple of thoughts. The National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK doesn't talk about InfoSec anymore. It talks about information assurance. And another great Briton, Tim Berners-Lee, who actually did invent the internet, he talks about clean data. And what this is that it's a responsibility to have, like we have governments providing us clean water and clean air, to provide us with clean data where we know that that data is genuine and where it's come from and we can trust it. And that is the key to having assured intelligence driving the Internet of Things. So I'll hand over to Paul, who's going to talk about some of the solutions that we need to bring that about. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rob. So IoT is so huge that it needs 2 moderators and 2 session blocks, right? Because this afternoon session is the first part, and then we'll continue with more speakers tomorrow. So Rob's and my role is really to sort of hopefully set the stage for the speakers that follow. 2 this afternoon, and then a panel amongst all our participants, and then 3 more speakers tomorrow. So Rob described my role as talking about the solutions. I actually don't think I will talk about solutions. Hopefully, our speakers will talk about solutions, and rather I'll play on that assured data, clean data analogy and argue, unsurprisingly, that identity has a role in assuring that cleanliness of data. And again, I won't talk too much about solutions. I have certain opinions about how we can do that. Rather, I'll try to tease out some relatively high-level, somewhat abstract requirements to enable that clean data, and then hopefully our participants that follow will propose particular mechanisms and technologies and how we use them to meet those requirements. So if Rob talked about the challenges, the nature of the hacks that we're currently seeing and the vulnerabilities in the IoT, I'm going to emphasize more the requirements that would mitigate those vulnerabilities. And then, as I said, we have 5 participants who will propose different solutions, different platforms, et cetera. And I'll try to tease out the requirements by imagining the life cycle of a thing. Similar to the life cycle of a user, just more silicon in the early stages. So there's a manufacturer, right? Somebody builds these things, and somebody has to integrate some sort of identity into that. The mechanisms by which identity is injected into those devices will ultimately manifest and be important because it'll be through that mechanism that those devices are subsequently recognized. Those things then shipped, whether it's to a smart home or to a factory or to a field or a jet turbine. Those things are shipped and deployed. And at that deployment time, we need to somehow register them into the appropriate identity management and security system under which they will operate. Over time, of course, we need to manage. We may need to refresh identities. We need to manage authorizations, all the maintenance of a physical object that will have identity implications. And then, hopefully at the end of a long and fruitful and productive career, we'll need to deprovision those and remove from them the privileges and authorizations that we had given them previously. So to some extent, that life cycle will exist in isolation. But for many things, it is the interesting combination between that life cycle and that of a user who to some extent runs parallel with the life cycle of the device that teases out the most interesting identity implications. Because I'm not the first to argue that is the connection or the relationship or the interconnection between those two actors that is interesting and ultimately more challenging. There's been a couple of speakers over the last 2 days that have pushed back a little bit on the IoT, the acronym IoT, asserting that, well, we've done SCADA and we've done M2M for years. I would argue that what is new is the recognition of this interplay, and that it does warrant a new name and a new descriptor. The recognition that devices will oftentimes operate on behalf of given users, and so it is the relationship between those two that is ultimately more fundamental. So I'll try to tease out requirements around that initial registration. It's shipped, it's arrived, you've unboxed it, you plug it in. How do you get it to the point where it can start to function? How can you give it identities it needs to do its job in its new context? How do you leverage the identities that it might have shipped with? Clearly, if it's going to operate and do anything other than trivial operations, we need to be able to authenticate it, authorize it, and every other actor that interacts with it. So there's got to be a symmetrical authentication and authorization for all the different permutations of interactions between actors, whether it's device-device, device-user, et cetera. And then critically, we need to acknowledge that, again, these two life cycles are interwoven. And so there will need to be mechanisms by which we make those connections, we make that relationship manifest between that of a user and that of a device. So we need to bind those identities together. That needs to manifest somehow. We need to manage that, authorize that over time, and then for some devices, reassign those privileges elsewhere. That could be at the end of the device's life cycle, or it could happen daily. So it's those three relatively large buckets of requirements that I'll try to expand a little bit more on, and hopefully that will give us a framework that we can think about when listening to our participants both this afternoon and tomorrow morning. So registration again, the device is shipped. Ultimately, we need to get it on the network and get it functioning. And getting it on the network presents its own challenges, right? Because typically, we need to provision it with some sort of credential. In many use cases, we need to provision it with a Wi-Fi credential. How does that happen? How do we provision it with comparable credentials, not for accessing the Wi-Fi, but for accessing network endpoints? Is there an optimization possible between those two provisioning steps? Because currently, they're mostly separate, and at least in the smart home, distinctly painful in different ways. The provisioning of that credential presumes that you've been able to validate whatever credential the device shipped with, whatever identifier, whether it's a cert or something else, some private key embedded. So that presumes a root of trust. How do we bootstrap trust from that device credential and give it the necessary permissions to issue it new identities, new credentials, and add it to our directory? This process of registration may be facilitated by user involvement, and that could be an administrative user in an enterprise scenario, or it could be the homeowner. A different set of permissions, a different set of privacy challenges between those two distinct cases. And what I would argue and propose as a model is that what registration ultimately ends up with, the end result, is that that device is issued a new set of credentials, distinct from that which it shipped from the factory with, that will be targeted and used for the applications that that device will use on an ongoing basis. Privacy, security, scoping advantages to that exchange of a primary credential with which it shipped to a different set of credentials that it uses in an everyday process. And where there's a user involved, those tokens can represent again, the relationship between that device and that user. And those relationships may not last long. So the next stage, after the device has been registered, issued some set of tokens that represent what it is and what it's going to do, is the ongoing maintenance and management of the relationship between that device and the users on whose behalf it operates. Hopefully it always operates on somebody's device, or we've created a monster. Those users can change in the smart home. A smart scale can operate on my behalf, my wife's behalf, my children's behalf. Nests, as an example, sort of operate on behalf of the family as a whole in the enterprise. What does a factory floor robot work on behalf of the enterprise, or perhaps some admin that set it up? The Kantara Initiative Identity Relationship Management recently issued a white paper going into greater detail into these concepts. I don't know specifically about IoT, but many of the concepts I think would apply. So many relationships will be long-lived and persistent, but others may be ephemeral. And if a relationship is ephemeral, then the burden of establishing it probably has to be much smaller. Otherwise, it's just probably not worth the effort of setting it up if it's going to only last for a few seconds or a few minutes. It hopefully can be set up in some dynamic nature, depending on the use case and the relevance and persistence of that over time. And then ultimately, if these devices are going to do anything, they need to be able to send their data or respond to directives to operate in some behalf. So we need to ensure that all actors are authenticated and authorized. And we'll, throughout this afternoon and tomorrow, tease out the different permutations of those interactions, all of which require authentication and authorization, but probably have different appropriate mechanisms. And as I've argued, my best practice by the means by which a device would authenticate, both to other devices and to endpoints, would be by presenting tokens that it had previously received as part of the registration and management to its services and endpoints and gateways and all the other actors with which it needs to interact to do its job. But critically, many of those interactions won't be HTTP. So there'll be MQTT or CoAP, some protocol more optimized for the constrained nature of these tokens or devices. They'll also be constrained in their ability to retrieve those tokens. So things like the OAuth device flow, which recognizes that not every device has a screen, becomes relevant. And how do you address those limitations? Some of the things that we've been talking about over the last 2 days about managing risk for users are just as relevant for devices. How do you mitigate the risk of token theft? Well, you look for anomalous behavior, not just in the users, but in the devices as they operate. And then Rob talked about the potential implications of edge architectures, where data doesn't always go to the cloud. Sometimes data stays locally. How do you ensure authentication and authorization can still be implemented in those architectures? We can't presume that the identity management platform or infrastructure is always available if it's in the cloud. So, once again, beating that horse that is the soap analogy to death, these are, I think, some of the tools that are relevant, some of the soaps, if you will, begrudgingly, that will be applicable to addressing those requirements. So some of them are I think, pretty straightforward. Devices are often issued certs at manufacturer time, X509 certs. OAuth and Connect are being profiled for these new constrained devices. We're recognizing the limitations of those devices. Machine learning applied to device authentication and not just user authentication. UMA promises to give us a means to manage those relationships that I've argued are important. And blockchains, right? Blockchains may have a role in creating that root of trust that I indicated. So if those are the high-level tools that might be applicable, and these are the requirements, then our 5 speakers, they might disagree with this characterization, but that's not my problem. I see them fitting in to these portions of the event. So our first speaker will be Mark Diodati from Gartner. So Mark's going to talk about existing IoT platforms and their IoT capabilities, which necessarily have to deal with registration, relationship management, and authentication and authorization. So necessarily, Mark's focused on how IoT platforms hit that center. Alex Weinart from Microsoft will follow. Same focus in the sense of a platform's ability to address these 3 pieces, but focused on Azure IoT's ability to do so as opposed to a broad overview. And then tomorrow we have Alex Babineau from Nully talking about graph databases. And the value proposition of graph databases is their ability to manage those relationships. And in this context, relationships between devices and users and users and users and so forth. Who else? Rajiv Dholakia from Knock Knock is going to argue the relevance of the FIDO model for authentication in the IoT. Not just user to cloud as it's currently focused, and we've heard about today, but more generally, device to device, user to device, et cetera. And then lastly, Mance Harmon from Swirls will explore the implications of using a DLT or a blockchain for capturing relevant provenance and history and identity attributes of devices. And that, I think, sits in the intersection between that root of trust necessary as part of the registration flow and subsequent authentication and authorization. So here's an overview of the full track. So following Rob and myself will be Mark, then Alex, and then all participants in the track will join us on a panel to end today's session, and then we'll have 3 more participants tomorrow. So with that, thank you very much, and I'll invite Mark Diodati to come up. Any questions about what Rob described, what I've talked about, or just the structure of the panel before Mark kicks off?